My name is Dr. Liz Burton-Crow, and I'm the Director of Education for the Carrillo Center for Nonviolence. Welcome to our special Living One event, Creative by Nature, where we will explore the intersection between arts and nature, as well as the co-creative power of artistic expression, to the relationship between arts, science, and a holistic sense of self. Today's event features a panel of talented artists from around the world who will attempt to help us answer the question, does art offer an alternative to science for understanding nature? Historically, science has been the de facto expert on the nature of nature. But as the authority on animals and the rest of Earth's family, other relational ways of understanding nature have become marginalized. In this special Living One webinar event, Creative by Nature is exploring the role that the arts play in our understanding of nature. The three artists on this panel will sketch out their visions of how creativity can inform and transform how we understand the world around us. Maggie Campbell is an artist and performance maker, inspired by futures that include and make peace with the non-human. Silton is founder and executive director of Communities Create, a nonprofit that hosts art workshops for vulnerable communities in Los Angeles. Deke Weaver is professor of new media, School of Art and Design at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. So welcome. Thank you all for being here to our arts panelists, and guiding our conversation today is the director of the Carrillo Center, Gabe Bradshaw.
Hello, everyone. And to iterate, wonderful to have everyone here. It's really a special and exciting time. So let's just dive right in. First of all, just to give the listeners and viewers a kind of some setting or a little orientation, could each of you three, Maggie, Karen, and Deke, just give like a 5-minute crunched arc of your life or your experiences that brought you to your work today? Karen, do you want to start?
Sure. I like to set the time just so that I kind of keep track of it. Otherwise, it could go on too long. So I'm an artist by nature, I really feel. I do have some training in art as well over the years. I'm from Los Angeles. I grew up here. I'm a child of the kind of post-war era, like growing up in the 1950s and 1960s. Immigrant family. My father came here as a teenager from Europe. My mother was a Depression era survivor. I was a family of 4 children. It was a very middle class family, very middle class neighborhood. Kind of just a lot of anxiety and boredom. I would say growing up, we had to kind of just keep ourselves busy doing things. The basic thing was that we got to be out in nature. We were taught to ride bikes really early. My father took us on camping trips, and we went down to the beach and to the mountains. And that really infused me, I would say, as a child, in a really, really positive way. The other thing that was really helpful, I think, for me was that being very interior and being in a family where we really were kind of expected to conform, and just like kind of go along with things, and not be too different or resistant. I just withdrew into art as a child, and then also into some degree of writing, but mostly just like coloring, and just like really spent a lot of time on an interior world. Eventually that got dissolved. It kind of got delayed, I would say, just delayed for many years. The public school system did not really, really encourage creativity, even though I got a lot of attention early on as being creative because I understood perspective somehow, just intuitively. But as I would say that until I became an adult, early adult years, I really just was trying to be in the system, try and be a part of the system and try and go along with the system. I was not one of those externally rebellious types. I would just say more like I kept it to, kind of kept a lot of things inside. when I finally did turn to art as an adult, it was more as a kind of a salve to like the wounds of kind of trying to go along with a system that was really not encouraging of being an individual. It was so, I just didn't understand it. I didn't really relate to a lot of things, but it just didn't seem to like work for me. So fast forward to like today, and kind of in my recent say adult years, I just it's like it became a need for me to like take care of family, and because I wasn't really prepared to go along with things in a systematic way, and my internal nature going back to childhood was really about tuning into something that was greater than what I could really observe, but it was a very intuitive, imaginative, creative process. That took me to becoming an educator and a professional artist, and creating lots of different kinds of products over time, being an entrepreneur, and eventually leading to my work in social justice, which is, community activist, and starting this nonprofit, Communities Create, which has been recent years. And I'm just really excited about being able to talk about this, and trying to like kind of draw this thread through what you're what you have built, I would say, Gay, and what these other artists I'd love to hear about too, is this importance of honoring this self, this creative self, and giving that freedom to express oneself, and how I am carrying that over into communities that are vulnerable and that are have not had the opportunities to express themselves or be encouraged to express themselves.
Oh, great, Karen! That's a wonderful thumbnail. I'll take it and expand on in the conversation. Deke, you're the tile below. Can you just give us kind of a short little arc similar to Karen's?
Yeah,
of your own experience?
Sure. Well, first, thanks for having me, and it's great to be here with all of you. I kind of, I guess, fell into art a little bit after, I ended up getting a double major in art and biology. And the art thing originally was sort of focused on photography. And then I ended up taking, in grad school, took a class on something I thought was going to be about museum studies, but it was actually photo installation, which I was like, I came from such a small school that it was very traditional. So the first thing our teacher was showing us was performance art from the 60s, body art from the 60s. And it kind of blew me away. So really quickly, I got involved with dropping the photography pretty quickly, and realizing that everything that I was really attracted to around photography was the stories. And that was kind of a life-changing thing. And so after leaving grad school, we spent about 10 years on the West Coast, and then 6 years in New York, and been here in East Central Illinois at the University of Illinois for like 15 at this point. At some point, I started working on a project that felt like it was kind of fusing these two different parts of my, well, they're not really separate, but sort of this idea that everything in the work that I'd been doing, there was always some animal that was showing up in my work. And so it felt like the possibility of making a platform where, so I ended up making this project called The Unreliable Bestiary, which is a performance for each letter of the alphabet, each letter represented by an endangered animal or habitat. And I don't say species because I use sort of the big global, not global, but, fairy tale words like monkey or elephant or wolf. They're not specific species, but and then starting with the animals that just what a lot of folks would call charismatic megafauna. And but in doing this, it's sort of, there's a lot of research that goes into these performances, and they take a lot of time to put together, and they're often set in settings that reflect the human-animal relationship. So say, for instance, for elephant, we, which I worked with Gay a little bit on a lot of her work there. But we did that in a big stock pavilion that was built in 1910. And so the idea that domestic elephants, if there is such a thing in Thailand, they're considered livestock, just like they're rated just like sheep and pigs and cows. There's also relation to this space that felt like it felt like a Roman amphitheater, and with battling, and that's felt like it was related to stories from parts of India where different kings would have their sort of prize fighting elephants, and they'd almost be, battling these elephants against each other, almost like cockfighting, where they would lather their elephants all with ghee, with butter, so the elephants could get a good grip on each other. So it goes into a lot of different, these things go into a lot of different histories and myths, and but then also trying to locate it, link it back into the Midwest, and why the story about elephant would actually have something to do with the Midwest of the US, and finding stories about circuses and elephants that live here now, but then also going back to 3,000 years ago when there were mammoths on the planet, on this continent. So they take a while to get put together because they end up taking a lot of fundraising, a lot of research, and there's also sort of a pretty intense postpartum thing after these things, because you're just sort of reading more and more about climate change and how things are going. It's pretty dark. So there's there feels like a section in there where I'm just reading mystery novels for a little while that kind of like pull a blanket over my head for just a tiny bit. But so the ones we've done are, we started with monkey, then we did elephant, wolf, bear, tiger, and now it looks, since we already did W, looks like I'm working on cetacean. So some sort of whale project, and then probably also a tree project. So that's where I'm at right now.
Deke, let me ask you a quick question. As a performance, are these recorded? Do you have them filmed? Are they,
Yeah.
or do they, I know you have pieces of it, but are they ever filmed as an entity as such, or are you emphasizing the participation and actual observation?
Well, no, I definitely like that, but I'm not a purist about that stuff. So yeah, they're documented pretty carefully with multiple cameras. And I spent a long time editing the different video, the different streams together so yeah, and I end up making DVDs and digital video and different libraries buy them, and different animal studies folks show them in classes. And I also end up making, it's kind of slow going, but I end up making artist books out of each thing. So they all feel like translations of the initial thing. So like you'll, in a performance, a lot of times sometimes you can't hear something so well, or something, you're distracted, so you miss a big chunk of script or something like that. And you'd be able to get all of that with the book, but you're not going to be able to get the tactile sort of visceral sensation of the actual performance. So they all the different media have something to offer, but yes, thanks for asking. Yeah, they definitely, the idea with the books is that by the end of it, and the way I'm going, it once every 3 years. I don't think I'm going to reach all 26 letters by the time I'm dead, but part of it might be about trying to figure out how to pass the project along to, make it something that could be crowdsourced or a curricular sort of thing where different people around the world could pick up parts of it and complete the thing. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. And Maggie, over in the UK, you would also call yourself a performance artist or something a little bit more refined or whatever?
Definitely along the lines of that. I work a lot in a collective, so we sort of make performances together, and it's quite rare that I'm using my actual body in a performance, although I have before. Mainly work with dancers, and I guess I wanted to say a huge thank you to both you and Liz for bringing everyone together, and to be able to speak with some really incredible artists as well as really, really fantastic. So thank you for all coming. And I guess my sort of arc, I had a quite strange childhood where because of my parents' work, we moved to 9 different countries, and living mainly in North Africa and Eastern Europe. So I think that's really where my love of other animals and nature kind of came in. I was always engaging with these animals who were often, living sort of domestic animals living in the streets, like dogs, cats, all these sorts of things. And I think it was quite natural for me to go into the arts, although I wasn't explicitly encouraged to do so. Didn't really have much in the way of arts education in high school. And I ended up going into theater design, which didn't quite, my degree was in theater design. And I found that I was really interested in these other worlds and other experiences of other animals, and trying to bring that into performance, and sort of mainly working with puppetry, costume, installation, just kind of creating these experiences, and especially with dancers, because they can so embody other creatures, and it's I find that really fascinating. So and then when I was in final year of my degree, I came across Gay's work with the elephants, and that was just another string that put me on this path. And now I am working with the collective. I have done a few sort of freelance design jobs, but it all kind of revolves around that creaturely, otherworldly, animal focused kind of work, as well as working a bit with children, teaching and educating, and working with communities making things as well. So that's kind of how I came to it.
Great. Well, thank you. We're going to just kind of do this sort of organically, but so I'd like to really turn it over to the three of you. We will have a question and answer for people who are listening and viewing, but I'd like you guys to really take, as your work is, center stage in terms of the dialogue that will emerge. So I'm going to just say right off, please talk about our subtitle. Does art offer an alternative to science in terms of understanding nature? And is that question attractive to you? What does that question mean to you? And, go on, just one of you start and feel free to disagree or agree. And Liz can be the arbitrator in terms of there's too many hands.
Yeah, I think what first comes to mind in terms of that question is that art and science essentially used to be the same thing, and especially in more recent history or even medieval, I just keep thinking of those sort of um, medieval science. There was so much artwork that came out of it, and the kind of drawings and paintings and imagination of people was just sort of much taken much more seriously in that way. And I think it's something that's continued to separate as we've gotten to where we are now. But I think it is coming back together. You're seeing when Deke was mentioning about sort of climate change, artists and scientists are coming together to collaborate. And it's because of this exchange of, I think, the ways that they think are incredibly similar and forward thinking, and sort of all encompassing of different subjects and perspectives. But at the same time, I feel that there is still definitely this sort of separateness. But yeah, that's sort of that was my first kind of thoughts when I came across the question.
Karen or Deke, would you?
You're muted, Karen.
Thanks, Deke. Yeah, I've spent a lot of time really thinking about this, and even, this particular question, Gay, just is art an alternative to science, and how, in which way, how does it, how do I look at, how do I feel about it? How do I think about this question? It's like, science, especially like in sort of more recent years, the whole idea of like fractals and the idea of seeing the infinite patterns that exist in nature, in science, whether it's in trees and in various kinds of vegetables or whatever. It's like I was always drawn to that. I was drawn to like those kinds of patterns and shapes. And I think because I just did that naturally, and seeing that there were like different shades of green, or there's different kind of like the circular patterns and all of that. And I'm a mosaic, I ended up becoming really very drawn to mosaics as time went on. So just the idea of putting different pieces together in different shapes, to me, has like kind of a scientific organic quality. It's just that in a lot of ways, we think in terms of science being very, very linear and very programmatic, and very much about categorizing and separating and dividing, and siloing, and even our medical system, like the whole idea of like not going to a doctor for a specific thing, as part of your body, instead of a holistic approach, which, I mean, there are like obviously holistic approaches in health, and it's becoming more and more along those lines. But that's what I think about art, as really being much more of an experiential, holistic approach. And Dewey, who I think, like I just resonated with, but I didn't even know John Dewey as a philosopher and psychologist and educator. He just says art is putting our true nature on display before ourselves. And I just think, like how a lot of times art is like the product and the end result of what we're doing. And I really had a hard time. I think a lot of the years that I wasn't creating art, it was because I was like so much thinking about like that product. Everything is kind of like oriented that way. So I really didn't understand it's about this process, the process and the experience, which is also for me about nature. I mean, I think they're just so intertwined. And so really, in a way, science and art are really intertwined, and we are needing to like just not think of it as being separate. It's just the orientation, reframing it. So
yeah, reframing makes sense, and it feels in a lot of ways that the trying to think of it as an alternative that's fine, but it just feels that automatically ends up putting it into kind of like a dichotomy, or like they're combating. And it just feels like the possibilities for art are lots of different ways, and it just feels like so much of what we need right now is like a multiplicity of voices and a lot of different ways to cut the cake. And so one of the things that art really can do is it can really pack an emotional punch. And so in terms of affecting policy or affecting different kinds of change, it seems like that art can be really do it in a way that raw data isn't really going to do. So if you have data about just say water in Flint, Michigan, it's if you're hearing about like the amount of lead in the water, it's probably not going to affect you the same way as you're going to hear stories of what people are living with that water in their home. So it just feels like art can be a synthetic agent to bring all these different sorts of ideas together and make sense of them in a time where a lot of things don't make sense. And so it feels it feels really important right now. And it's just sort of I think for some of us it's just sort of not getting you kind of have to check your ego at the door and not worry about it if you're not getting listened to, or just keep going forward, I guess.
Well, as I mentioned, as I told you, my disclaimer was the subtitle was sort of my provocative kind of thing, in the sense of that there has been a tradition, we're speaking within a certain realm of, say, the dominant, Western educational and political system, where what we call science has been the dominant and the overriding decision maker and truth maker. And although there have been different media, literally, whether it's poetry or whether it's passionate writing of some sort. I mean, what I'm trying to say, it's not so poetry or creative writing, but passionate writing. We see a lot of scientists who are not just writing, abstract introduction methods and conclusions. They're writing theirs, the Attenborough kind of thing. They're writing more of their own experience and their reflections, etc. But push comes to shove, still, science really has the ultimate authority in terms of making decisions about nature, aka specifically animals. So an expert on elephants, an expert on so-and-so is a scientist. Mm-hmm. It's not someone like Daphne Sheldrick. I'm using Daphne as an example because I knew her, and everyone else does. I don't know what her education was. She probably went to finishing school, whatever, but she was not a scientist. And yet the depth and breadth of her understanding of elephants exceeded anyone's. I mean, I'm sure there's other people, but within the sort of the white Western world that is dominated by an expert system. So the thing is that, and for many years, she was sort of poo-pooed by the elephant research scientists in that way. So there's that still kind of momentum. And so the reason I said this is because it also was keyed off what you said, Karen, here, which I found fascinating, was that you were describing your childhood and that you withdrew into art. And I found that really interesting in the sense of withdrawing from this collective, withdrawing in a sense of, and this is where I think the very interesting political, psychological, whatever interface is, the self science as such in our education system is collectively based. Its validity is collectively based, whereas in art, yeah, I mean, it does take, a certain amount of certain people, if they say this is a great painting, then it's a great painting, right? But art, the way the three of you have discussed it, and sort of my own experience secondhand, is that we're really talking about the redefinition of authority coming from an individual, not necessarily the authority, but authority and insight and understanding, which is not preempted by the collective of science.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting how you mentioned that scientists are beginning to be a bit more Attenborough-esque with their introductions and abstracts and things like this, because I did read this quote, and I am forgetting who said it, but that it is so important to the science how the scientists doing it actually imagine life. And I think that speaks to sort of this experiential knowledge that people like Daphne, for example, would have, and how if you don't have a degree or if you haven't been educated in the Western way, it's might be, it probably will be discredited or ignored, or sort of people might say, oh, well, there's no sort of proof or evidence to kind of back that up. And I think not even for artists, but people who have all these other kinds of practices, whether that's just being with in like I mean, I'm just continuing to go with your example of Daphne Sheldrick, but just having that intimate kind of knowledge that you can't really, maybe you can't explain it, but art's kind of an excellent space to think about it and to try and convey things that maybe can't be kind of spoken about, and that's still incredibly important to us as humans, because at the end of the day, you can't categorize everything or put everything in these kind of linear boxes and tables, and but that doesn't mean that it's not still important and adds something essential to the bigger picture of kind of understanding life. Yeah.
So that it's not, so much as, I mean, although the provocation, Deke, was to make it provocative, but it's this notion is, can art, in the way that you three, we'll just use you three right now, in other words, you see, I mean, I think you do, but I guess that's what I'm talking about. In other words, that, you are centerfold in terms of the UN, the discussion of the UN Council on Climate, that artists like you, for example, would be going in there as experts, but that expertise as such is not grounded in any kind of collective definition or authority. It's because of the work you're doing, and seeing it as a source of information, as a source of guidance, as a source of deep understanding. That's really what that does not necessarily dismiss the tables and the numbers, but rather begins to bring in that spoken and somatic and affective experience on a personal level, which is speaking to a global or community level.
Yeah, I find that aspect, Gay, really fascinating to even think about and ponder, because like with my work in communities that are, especially women who have been experiencing homelessness, and their sense of self, their sense of like what space can they actually occupy? It's like there's the sense of home that they have to like create within themselves in a way. And in terms of art making, I think about like, well, what is this like space that I can, just like I spoke about, that I can go into, that I don't even really have to say, okay, bye everybody, I'm going into this space. It just happens automatically. But I don't know if that would happen. I'm kind of curious what Deke or Maggie, if you have any sense of what that's like over time, like, because I think maybe if I hadn't just discovered that as a child, would I have been able to like even do that like today, like in this past year, for instance, with COVID, I found a space that I started just becoming really, really attuned to and awakened with nature, like just right outside our window when these mourning doves were nesting in our patio. And I just immediately became like enveloped in the day-to-day unfolding of that story, of their story. And then that became kind of like a shared story that I brought into my studio. And then it rippled out, I think, into the workshops, the virtual workshops with the women at the Downtown Women's Center. It was like this like kind of flow. I felt it. I could talk about it as an experience, but how do other people like really understand what that's about? That's where science, I feel like, can be so, in some ways, invasive and not in a really positive way, if it starts saying, like, diagnosing, say, like, oh, this behavior or that behavior, so that like the self-doubt or the need to conform becomes like so overwhelming, or to listen to an authority like you were talking about, and just feeling like, okay, that has to like take over everything. I can't just like really have this space that's like left, undefined somehow by me myself.
I feel like that, at least in my experience, that really depends on the scientist, and in some ways it feels like it depends on the scientist, and it feels like it depends on their discipline, what their subject is. I think a lot of like working on the wolf project, it's like a lot of the wolf scientists I was running into, wolf biologists I was running into, is there always seemed to be this sort of surprise about, most of them really just wanted to be out in the field, tracking the wolves, watching them, doing all that. But they ended up feeling like, to actually get them reintroduced to Yellowstone or anything, they had to go into these meetings with bulletproof vests to just be talking to people who were super angry about this situation from both sides, and so it really ended up becoming a thing about, it's not so much about the animals, it's not really about what we would call nature, meaning something separate from us. It was about people, and it was about like public relations, so the trick, I feel like what art can do is it can put people into that space you're talking about, Karen. It can be a doorway into that, for want of a better word, that flow state, where it's like, where you are aware of the present, you're aware of that moment and being right there in your skin, excuse me. And I think that can be, there's definitely artists, like you were saying, there's definitely artists that are, scientists that can do this thing, or are finding ways of, or maybe artists that are more science minded, like James Baylog with his Chasing Ice, project. there's definitely bridges between the two, but it's not but, it's just like, it's more, and, you know, it's more, let's, I mean, because when I'm getting ready for these different shows, like I'm doing a lot of reading about the data, you know, I'm reading a lot of data, but at the same time, I'm also reading about like the fairy tales about the creatures, you know, or like how they exist in different myths, and how we've, you know, started doing this in terms of how we understand them, because they're not in our lives anymore, they're not around us anymore. So trying to use that data and trying to use these old stories and trying to imagine new stories as a way of knitting these things back together, as a way to form some sort of understanding of the present, something like that. Yeah.
I have to admit, there's two little anecdotes, I'll keep them short, that I think kind of brought this topic on. One was back in the Pleistocene, as I say, when I was working as a research mathematician with the government. And there was a graduate student from Yale, and she was interviewing researchers who were working in the forest. You know, very much like the wolf people you were talking about, Deke, you know. So these are people who were out and about and everything. And that time the old growth was a really big deal. So anyways, she came to interview me, and I was obviously the only woman. And so I asked her, I said, you know, you don't have to give any names, but, you know, what are your responses? One of the questions that she was asking was, what's your favorite landscape? You know, what is it? And when you're out there, what does it make you feel like? And da-da-da-da. And so she said, for the majority of the men, and that's significant because they were mainly men in forestry, they started to cry. And then she told me, she said, one man said, the only way I can answer this, and then he pulls out a painting that he had done. And he said, this is the only place that I can put what I really feel. I can't put it in my science. So that's anecdote one. The other one involves someone more personal. You, Deke. I was asked to write an analysis on polar bears. And there was this huge multi-million-dollar effort in Canada to grab wild polar bears and bring them into this research center. And, you know, it was to save them and reproduction. So they wanted to know my opinion, right? So I was asked to write this, and I'm sure you all can guess what it is. But at the beginning of the report, I mean, the report did not go over well. I'll put it that way. There was a lot of corruption, you know. The scientists saying, no, you know, ABC were the same scientists who were the recipients of the money and the project and things like that. But I want to tell you that I used your polar bear, I think you call it polar god, that does the little snippet. Yeah. Which I encourage everyone, maybe we can post it later. But I use that as as basically the showcase. And I got letters from people saying, you know, I stopped reading anything you wrote afterward. Thanks, Deke. You know, I worked damn hard because it said it all. because that right there was the answer to my question. You know, these were people that went out for quote unquote peer review to other scientists saying, based on this report, what is your conclusion and recommendation? So I got a letter from a couple of them. I mean, not everyone, but basically said that was what it did for me right there, is it answered my question. So I guess those two little seeds were sort of brewing in me, which has brought this conversation. And I think you're all talking about it, but I wanted to bring that up in terms of the notion of the need. This is what Karen had brought up, and also Maggie, was, you know, that we're talking about the level of authority of an individual versus a self-appointed collective. And so understanding, you know, and you guys are art people and you know all these things and I don't, but you know, it's less art than it is the voices that are using a medium of expression and communication.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting as well, about the individual and the collective, because I do feel that art is something that is kind of inherently the collective, because sort of what you're speaking about, Gay, people can see a painting or something like that, and you don't have to really have a background in a certain subject or really understand language necessarily to see that, and um, to understand what somebody might be trying to say, or even just the feeling. And I think that's the really powerful thing about it, is that people can get these feelings or these impressions that are maybe nonverbal or very visual or very experiential, and it is sort of a collective thing, because it especially when you're watching a performance, for example, I would say that there's a power in that kind of everybody's experiencing something, and they're definitely having different specific kind of thoughts in their heads, but in general, that work is kind of giving something out, and it's a collective kind of experience in a lot of ways. And I think I think the other thing is of course, like in the scientific world, there's a lot of issues around who's funding the research, or who's what's the agenda of whatever. And I think there's obviously problems like that in the art world as well. Like, it's definitely not without its problems and agendas, and people still get and voices are still kind of marginalized, or but I think in terms of other people engaging with it, maybe it's sort of, there's more of an in for people, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's really important. Yeah.
Do either of you, sorry, go ahead.
No, I wanted to ask Karen more about your sort of would you agree with that kind of, in terms of individual, collective kind of?
Well, I don't know. I was like sitting here and I was thinking about that that exhibit and art show that was mounted, years ago on these rail. I don't know. They were like on elephants. That whole art presentation on elephants, and it was out like in these box cars or whatever, and the whole presentation of it was like so artistic and all of that, but it was and it was designed in such a way for, like, I think, to have like kind of a collective experience, for people to like come through, the public come through and really be awed by nature, but it was so orchestrated, and it was so like not natural in a way. It was and it was in a way a lot of, I think, they put a book together afterwards with all of the photographs and everything. Do you remember that, Gay? I can find the name of it, but it struck me that when there's a lot of money that's spent for anything that relates to art, or is called money and art, then comes together as commerce, and then and in a way it's conveyed so that people are more or less manipulated into kind of an emotional response, from my perspective anyway. that's not really what I'm really interested in talking. I mean, so much in referring to like this in terms of this conversation, because I think that in some ways, a lot of the mediums that were, even though I think there's so much power in visuals and in potentially in cinema or in performance or in theater or whatever that can be used in a really creative way. It can also be used in the opposite way, to like really fabricate or kind of instigate emotions in one direction or another, as we've seen, especially we've seen these last number of years, right? How it can be co-opted. So I don't know if that's actually answering your question, Maggie, but I think that in some ways going back to like the individual, and really allowing the individual to really just be its own, self-determined agent of expression just on its own, that doesn't have to be attached to anything else, but it's just okay just on its own, is something that we're not like really used to, maybe from my perspective, really thinking about. It's like there just seems to be like a need to over-organize maybe, around, just even in terms of technology, in terms of social media and all of that. And so then you're kind of like wondering like, well, these hashtags, whether it's Me Too or whether it's any of these hashtags where a large number of people, it's like how many people want like to have an Instagram that is like goes viral or YouTube that goes viral. Is that really what we're talking about, in terms of art making in that sense, where everybody's like trying to just like get that big, kind of big hit or big impact on as many people as possible, I don't know. I'm just throwing out ideas and questions. I'm not saying that there's an answer necessarily to this.
I mean, in some ways that sounds more like those are two different things. There's art and then there's marketing of the art. So it's like like some of the most moving things I've ever seen were just for an audience of like 5 people, and nobody's going to remember those things. And I don't even know if the other 4 will remember it, but I remember it, and it really meant a lot to me. And nobody, and so it's like, and it's that thing of like, I mean, just looking at Instagram, it's sort of like, sometimes you'll see something that is really good that has like, 50,000 likes or whatever, but it's a lot of times it's not. A lot of times it's sort of pretty ordinary and pretty sappy and just kind of, so I don't think there's not a 1 + 1 = 2 sort of situation there, but it's but on the other hand, I feel kind of like it's like trying to find a balance between the two, because it's like, like being in a meeting with somebody who's like the social media director for, is it 350 or 360.org? I'm 350, Bill McKibben. Is it 350 or 360? I don't,
60.
Anybody know?
360.
360, okay.
Well,
So
at least there is a 360, I know that.
yeah. Well, I mean, so they're when they're talking about art, they're completely talking about like efficacy. They're talking about like what can get the most people, get their eyeballs right there. What it's very much a linear sort of thing. And anything else that doesn't catch your attention is just not worth the time, because the earth is on fire. So we've got to, that's the thinking there. So, and I think that's probably true to some degree, but on the other hand, I think there's going to be other people that are wanting more, that is sort of the earth might be on fire, but it's I don't know. I guess this all gets into all kinds of different sorts of ideas about what it means to live a life, who can live it, how can we live it, and what's it going to be like? How are we going to take care of each other? How are we going to take care of other things around us? And what does that look like? You know, what sorts of work can, what sorts of work do you need to have around you to make things feel full and rich? And I don't know, something like that.
Well, let me ask one more question, and then I'm going to let you guys, either Liz, either open it, or you all continue. But as each one of you, has your work brought in your various, Deke, for example, in your different projects, and Karen, you know, in your evolving work, and Maggie with yours, have you felt that your art has brought you deeper understanding of nature? In other words, we've been talking about a lot of discussion about how art is affecting other humans. Has it brought you a deeper understanding, whatever that means? I use that word instead of study, but really understanding of nature and yourself and our relationship as nature.
That's a good question, Gay. I'll attempt to answer it. I think it's an ongoing process, a deepening process. You know, I mean, I think, you know, we talk about depth psychology and about archetypes and Jung, for all those, for some of you don't know about that, but it's really kind of an interior layering of the unconscious. And I found that particularly as times have gone on, you know, over time, this whole evolution in our culture and the world and climate change and all of the things that really are just kind of impacting us over, you know, more and more, the trauma, the you know, kind of like the spreading of grief and loss, you know, so that's just, you know, exponential. As that's happening, it seems like on another, you know, kind of like unconscious level, there's that sort of happening with me personally and with my relationship with others and my relationship with what's happening, you know, kind of globally. And so as I delve in, you know, as I kind of like turn to certain mediums that for me are much more fluid, particularly watercolor. It's funny because I worked in mosaics and clay and glass for these last, you know, say 10 or 15 years, but I've turned to watercolor again as like kind of a very immediate, sort of very much metaphorically part of my unconscious and kind of the unconscious metaphor for the world in a lot of different cultures as well. And things have kind of revealed through that certain aspects of nature. A big theme for me has been like bubbles and circles and kind of submergence and emergence, I guess, kind of together. And I had done, you know, kind of a series this past year, a lot, you know, like around these mourning doves, you know, kind of brought up a lot for me. They just like appeared in my artwork as well, but in this very like in many different layers, and this kind of like oceanic and this like these bubbles that are so much about like kind of being insulated and separate and kind of also kind of interconnected. So I feel like that's not something I set out to do on a conscious level. It's like this, you know, kind of an experiential, autonomous type painting that like just has just like appeared. So when you ask that question of like, if my artwork, or is that the question about like, has it taught me more about nature? It's like, I'm willing to have that dialogue or have that engagement with the medium and with my unconscious and see what actually appears. And that's an ongoing process, I think, for, you know, and I'm drawn more and more to to the places and to the areas where I don't have like try and eliminate as much as possible any kind of existing, I mean, it can't be done completely, but existing biases or expectations or anything, just to see what, just be open to like kind of what comes up. And seems like that is coming through more and more.
And the other half of the question, which I forgot, was if you're saying that you're deepening your understanding with nature, just shortening it there, is it having a transformative effect in terms of your relationship with nature and how you work with the doves, that you work with the dogs that are around you and the cats? I mean, there's obviously
I do think it. I mean, I'm very much aware of the witnessing part and the being with part that I don't know if I was as much with before. And because we have feeders in our patio that that I'm constantly like replenishing, and then also being out in where I feel most at peace right now is, and I think it always has been, but even more so, it's just like so deeply affirming to me to be around nature and to watch the interactions between all the different species, between the squirrels and the mourning doves and the finches and our cat that comes and goes, and to see their relationship with each other. And it's been interesting because it's changing too. It's been transforming as well during this time. At first, there was just much more of like anxiety of like, what are we going to, like, how are they going to interact? What are they going to do to each other? Will they do anything to each other? But there's like, seems to be more tolerance and kind of like, okay, we can all be here together. And I'm just like, have more hope from this, from even deepening this experience, that's more of what I, like we'll see hopefully happening, that I can share my experience with others around this. And that's all I can really do. I mean, and hopefully like through the art, have some emotional connection or deepening or awakening possible.
Maggie or Deke?
Yeah, I would say it's definitely made me kind of I would say that art is a way of kind of deepening that connection that you have, but it is a really interesting one because for me, I would kind of think, where does my art practice begin and where does it end? Sort of, is being out in nature kind of a part of it, and experiencing and being with these other creatures, is that just that's obviously a huge source of inspiration, and also kind of it's research for the work in a way. And I think just appreciating and kind of slowing down and really taking everything in is so important for that. And then it's also very strange because I don't know about, I mean, your studios look really, really light and beautiful, but like most of the ones in London, you don't have any windows to the outside, and it's a very highly what would you say, like constructed environment where you are cut off and you are inside. And so it's sort of like, your art practice can deepen your relationship with nature, but I think you're almost learning things about your art practice when you're in nature, and you might see something. You were mentioning the sort of patterns and the and natural forms and things like that, and I think there is a tendency in so much art to be kind of so aware of these natural forms and how we actually even perceive things visually, and that comes with nature, and what's that kind of dialogue between them as well. So it is really interesting. But I think anything that you take the time to do, and it is very experiential, cerebral, but also almost spiritual to be doing. I think anything that you do like that will and does deepen your kind of relationship with nature and others and creatures, and that's how
Is there an implicit reciprocity when you're describing that? Do you feel there's a reciprocity with the birds or moss or whatever? Is there a feeling? You said dialogue, but are you feeling there's a reciprocity that's a little bit more fluid that's coming through?
Definitely. And I think it is, we all kind of live in these highly stylized environments. And I think anything that you're doing with your full body and your hands, and, you're kind of letting your mind go, it's, things will come to you, and you can only be creating something that's kind of, you might be creating bad art, but you are creating something. So I think there is almost that reciprocity in surprising kind of ways, or if that made sense.
Makes lots of sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
One of the things I was thinking about just when you're talking, Maggie, is like that word constructed, and it's so, that's one of the things that for me can get really sad really quickly, is like in town here, and not, maybe 25 minutes away, there's a park that actually does have some old growth forest in it, but it's just like 4 square miles. And then there's another park here that's got a restored prairie in it that's smaller than that. And, and right around every single boundary of it is either, it's mostly corn, it's Illinois, so it's lots of corn. And going out to someplace like Yellowstone, it's sort of like, it's not that different. It's just a lot bigger, but it's still, but even if it's in its bigness, it still feels, unfortunately, there's a kind of, there's a little bit of a theme park feeling to it, of driving through the Lamar Valley and like, oh, they just released the bison. There's one, and it feels very, it does feel constructed in a way. And so the idea of what nature is, and how, like, that word, the Anthropocene, it's pretty intense, and so it's, but there are moments, like, kind of going back to what you were saying, Karen, with the mourning doves, like when we were in full lockdown, like the first month or so, it was, I just ended up spending a lot more time like building something in the yard. I was building like raised beds, I'm not a gardener, but I'm like, well, don't have anything else to do, I'm going to raise some beds. So, but it was just sort of like, just being aware of just what was going through the yard. Like, oh, wow, there's 20 cedar waxwings in that tree right now. And I've never seen that before because I'm always inside, and so having moments like that is real, that, but on the other hand, it's like, there's a lot, I feel like a lot of different scientists I would talk to is like, their whole goal of like working with wolves is to not see them, because they don't want to see them. They don't want to be seen. They just want to be working with their, DNA from their fur or from their scat or whatever. And for them, it's like really important to like not be leaving as little imprint on that place as possible. And so, and I get that. That makes a lot of sense. but on the first big, let's go to a place that has elephants was going to Thailand, and like looking back on it now, I probably wouldn't do what we did then, but it really had a 5-year-old kid of like, I want to put my hand on an elephant, and I probably wouldn't do that now, but it's, so the idea of being with the animals, I don't really feel like I am with the animals that much. I'm more about reading about them, talking to the people who are around them, and maybe I'll be able to find a place that is where I'll be able to sit and do that for some time. But it's all constructed, like going to India to try to see tigers. It's in these tiny little parks, and you're in the special Jeep, and you're going at the specific time, and even then it's just kind of like, I've only got 10 days, it's in this tiny little slot, and then I'm back here in the corn, so it's so I feel like, but on the other hand, there's a moment like in Wolf, where we put people on buses, took them on a 45-minute bus ride as rangers, telling people what's going to happen and saying, we released wolves like Yellowstone. We're going to try to get the trophic cascade to stop here, and we're going to fix it with releasing wolves. And everybody's like, wolves? Some people were believing we did this. And we got to this park and at sunset and walked people on a silent walk through the park as it's turning dark, and just realizing how little in this area, how little people actually do get outside, and just telling them to pay attention, walk in silence, pay attention to the color of the trees. And for a lot of people, that was revelatory, and so there's the experience of the world and what you're calling nature in the research, and then there's the moment of trying to do it actually in the art, in the moment of the performance. And there are two different things, but it just, in some ways, it just feels sort of like how you set the piece up, and I'm going on for a long time, so that's that.
That's very good. I love that.
Is it okay if other people, my name is Allison Miller. I apologize for getting on late, and I don't have my picture up because I barely have internet power here. We were out for 12 days in an ice storm.
Just a second, Allison. Liz, did you want to kind of make a
Yeah, we're just about to transition into the audience Q&A. So you actually have perfect timing, and you picked up on the segue perfectly. So, but before we do that, I just wanted to, first of all, thank the panel and thank all of you for taking the time to be here. I am struck, just bouncing off of Deke's comment about the irony that we are, in these electronic boxes. And so hopefully we do get a chance to go outside in nature and enjoy the color of the trees. I'm also going to do a couple shameless plugs here real quick before we open it up to you, the audience. So the first is that if you want to expand on this conversation, explore more of your creative side, Maggie Campbell is teaching a course called Creative Beings. The spring enrollment begins on March 14th. So I'm going to post a link for that in the chat box for those who are interested in that. You can register now, and it's going to be very exciting. There's some live workshops, and then there's also some beautiful pre-recorded lectures as well. So I hope you do check it out, or if you know folks who would be interested, please do send them our way, because Maggie is very talented, and it would be great to have a bigger community as well involved in this conversation. And then also our next Living One webinar will be 1 week from today. It's going to be artist and animal communicator Linda Fisher. So that's going to be March 7th. So please do join us if you have time. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and open it up. And it looks like, Allison, you are first in line. So feel free to unmute yourself and ask.
All right. Well, and I apologize for coming in so incredibly late. Gay has had some amazing, amazing programs. I'm so appreciative of, first of all, Gay, at the work you're doing and offering these presentations and connecting people globally is amazing. I met Gay through Oregon State University. I went back to college at 59 years old because of my observations of nature deteriorating here in Oregon. And I didn't have a way to express it. So I went back to college to understand those fundamentals of expressing myself at an analytical and scientific level, because the level of my expression had always been artistically expressed with nature. And I think we as artists have a responsibility to bring to life what is forgotten with each new generation as to what nature is. And, people younger than me, I realized that college had no expression or no idea of what the ecosystems had been like for me as a child here in Oregon. They were substantially richer experiences than what they were experiencing. So I began to express this in art to give them some kind of depth and connection of what it was that they were losing and what it was they needed to do to revitalize this element in their lives. I've learned the language of nature. As you look about you, you'll see it expressed in patterns on the wings of birds, shadows that trees make. These little nuances are actually a language that captivates our souls in subtle, small ways. And I recognize this last 12 days. I have been down without electricity because, Gay, we were hit pretty hard with the freezing rain. And I have a savanna ecosystem of magnificent old growth oaks here in Oregon. And I got about $100,000 to revitalize them in the last 20 years, to revitalize our ecosystems, and it was a success. But during the ice storm, I lost one 400-year-old savanna oak that, I have no words to express the language that I lost in that tree, how it expressed itself on this farm. And these are the nuances that we need to, as artists, intimately understand, possibly to the point of insanity, based on the elements of how the world interprets the world around them. But I don't think it's insanity. I think it's just intense awareness. And express this in our art, and not to be afraid to talk about it and to express about it and to look for the edge of the coin of what the world is missing and not seeing. So that's how I'm very appreciative of Maggie and Drake and you, Liz. I've just had a few minutes to listen to your magnificent words. They are priceless, and I'm looking forward to hearing more. So I'm going to be quiet now. That was just my 2 cents input. I am also a published artist, and I'm a Renaissance oil painter, and I do professional pen and inks in my work. If you Google Allison Miller in Oregon, my website might pop up. Thanks.
Thank you, Allison. And we do record these, and they're available on our website if you want to catch the first half of the presentation. So it's www.curlos.org. Did anyone else have any questions for the panel? If you don't, I do. All right.
Hi, I do have a question.
Yeah.
Well, first, thanks for putting this whole thing on. This is awesome. But I'm traditionally trained as a scientist, and I have been researching elephants for the last couple years, and that I was attracted to this show because I want to hear more about art and nature, being from completely opposite end. I mean, I guess it's not so opposite, but and just as we've talked about, you guys talked about that the data kind of loses a little bit about nature. The reason I'm studying animals and elephants is because I love them, and I love seeing them in person and seeing their individual personalities, and their lives are so intricate. And as I'm doing this data analysis and research, I feel like so much of that is lost. And I'm just kind of wondering what ideas that you guys have about how a scientist can connect with artists to kind of bridge that gap and bring the stories of science more to the public through art, and just ways we can work with you to make that happen.
Well, I'm not an artist, Jody, but I'll make one comment. I would say, ask you is, what do you feel is not being expressed and not included within the science that you think is so important to communicate?
Well, one thing I'm very passionate about is bringing to light that animals are as deeply emotional and deeply here and as a person as much as we are, and bringing that to people, and saying that animals are not lesser than us. They are not different, like talking as us as humans as them as animals is just one way that we divide ourselves. And just bringing back that these creatures are as much deserving as respect and of personhood as we are. I mean, we're still trying to get Happy the elephant out of the Bronx Zoo. She's been alone for 30 years, and they're saying, no, she doesn't have personhood. And I want to use science as a way to show people that they deserve more. And I think art and things like that will nicely complement it.
But the science is there. In other words, the science of, not to count trans pieces of psychology, but that's just a label, a post-it for the bulk of science, so that the science itself is saying exactly what you're saying. So maybe there's another element, though, that you're feeling is not communicating in the way that you wish.
Well, people are very weary sometimes of science, and it's hard to understand sometimes. Like reading some of these manuscripts and the scientific literature is not super easily accessible to people who aren't in the field, and sometimes that does scare people. And but trying to read these things, you're like, what is this statistic mean? And sometimes journalists, I think, don't necessarily portray it correctly. It's not transcribed well to the general public. And while the science is there, how can we make it more accessible to people through visuals, through literature, through dance and things like that?
I think there's a lot of artists out there that'd be open to working with you for sure, and some of it is just sort of making those connections. But there's also, I'm just thinking about, some of it might just be how you're telling your stories. You're not going to be doing your like anecdotes in some peer-reviewed journal, but somebody like Katie Poole writing Silent Thunder, it's a different book. It's a different venue. It's a different audience. And so it's okay for her to tell her stories in that venue, in that medium. But collaborating with other people, there's a lot of different possibilities. And I think if there's different artists out there that you are attracted to their work, even if they're not really working on elephants, people like to be noticed. So, if you wrote them and just said, hey, I'm really curious about this, you might get a response. You probably would get a response,
Yeah, I think that's, I think definitely, you would, and you should. And I think when it comes to these sort of things like recognizing other animals' personhood, or even, the whole climate crisis, it needs all these different people to come together and to put forward that information in these different ways. And that kind of emotional nuance as well is so important. And good luck. It sounds really great. I think, yeah, you should reach out.
Thank you, guys.
Well, I would encourage that you have something that you may communicate to artists who are, less experienced, say, with elephants, or, have not had that kind of contact in the way that you have. And that, to me, right there is like gold, to be able to communicate that to an artist. And then the artist, creates in his or her medium, that part of you that doesn't fit into the numbers, you know. And that right there is, to me, the beautiful, the gold. You know, it's that kind of, you know, relational experience, you know, and to be able to have that, you know, captured by an artist would be really beautiful.
I think that science is very excited to work with artists, to be honest with you. My experience as a non-scientist, stepping into a scientific realm where I had to learn to think more factually and less emotionally and express myself that way, gave me ample opportunity to understand this and bridge this relationship gap. And there's enormous opportunities for scientists who really do want to connect with artists and who fundamentally deeply believe that art is the mechanism for which to use as a catalyst to change the perspectives in society, to change generations of thinking patterns and neurological responses that Gay is so familiar with to their world. And I'm very excited about it. Jody, I'm really glad to hear what you had to offer. I have a lot of hope for that, and a lot of hope that you're going to make a connection with really amazing artists at levels that have not happened yet, and you'll be able to express your scientific understanding in incredibly creative ways. And I'm so appreciative that you're there. Thank you.
Thank you. Just going to add 2 cents before we see what Larry has his hand up about, which is to just recall, you know, what Deke had said, that science and art are not in opposition, and to remember that those bifurcations that we make internally may just be that, internal projections of bifurcations, and that you are not only a scientific person, I'm guessing you also are, at least in some ways, a creative person. And so, you know, to sort of not just say, oh, well, I'm not an artist, right? Well, maybe you're artistic. So don't necessarily, you know, relegate yourself or prune yourself into one limb. Let yourself be an entire tree, as it were. But all right, Larry, I saw you had your hand up. Do you have a question or a comment?
You might be muted, Larry.
He is, yeah, you're muted. Oh, connecting to audio. Technology. Larry, I think your audio is connected through the phone, so you might have to unmute via your phone rather than your computer account. Looks like Larry's having a couple issues, so I'm just going to go ahead and buy him some time by asking my question, and then he can hopefully get that sorted in the meantime. So you don't lose your spot in line, Larry. I'm just cutting a little bit. So as you guys were talking, it was really occurring to me that, you know, we talk about art and science as if they are purely human domains, but there are several artistic other species that we share the world with. For me, I think one of my favorite animal artists is the bowerbird. They make these beautiful habitats where they, you know, they decorate their homes, and sometimes they have an affinity for a particular color, and so they'll collect things that are blue, for example. And so I was wondering, if you know, the panel, each of you had sort of like an animal artist that really speaks to you, or that you've been drawn to throughout your work.
Yeah, what first springs to mind is the octopus, the way that they change their skin and can do these different patterns and sort of moving images on their skin. And I know they've been observed to do that one, and they're very solitary anyway, but I mean, I know they've also been observed to do that when, you know, there's no one around, or seemingly no reason. So I think, they must just enjoy it and love to experiment with all these different colors and patterns. And I find that really inspiring. And also just because, we don't think of especially marine kind of animals to have these kind of capabilities, or I don't know what it's like, artistic needs and wants. And I just think that's really, really beautiful and inspiring that there's these different patterns that they do. And apparently people have seen that there are certain ones that have different kind of styles or like different colors that they like. And I know that's part of their emotional vocabulary as well, like red for when they're angry and things like that. But just to know that they're out there in the water coming up with these different combinations makes me really happy. Yeah.
Well, I'm not sure if this is exactly responding to your question, Liz, but as far as animal artists, but I'm particularly drawn to all kinds of birds and have been for a long time. So, starting with, of course, the most flamboyant peacocks and their display of feathers and just even the birds in terms of, like how colors seem to like go along with more of the male birds, but like they're showing their colors in various ways and the iridescent colors. But I think particularly I've been drawn to all kinds of cranes and egrets, and in flight and in stillness, and how just the movement of their necks, how they can just like really draw up in these like kind of really like almost really tight balls, almost like vanish in the nature, wherever the setting is that they are, you almost can't hardly even see them, to like where they're just really just completely elongated. And when you're watching them, it's almost like they're dancing in a way with, and performing in a way, like with their various bodily movements and their leg movements, so that the neck can like stretch out into such really interesting patterns, and then also just like really curl up and kind of in sort of more circuitous pattern. And then of course in flight, I mean, I just love the show of the wings. It's like I became really attracted to cormorants this past year, and because they almost look like they're just, with their wings out in a particular formation, in like looking at the sun as they're like either drying their wings or just in a pose in a way. And I just never had like really noticed that so much before, but also like how the wingspan itself in different birds, and how they are just so magnificently expressive. I feel like they are expressing to me. That is like kind of, that is an artistic expression that I am really drawn to. And I feel like it really carries forth in terms of being inspiring to me in my soul and in terms of my artistic expression.
Thank you. It's very evocative. Now I have all these birds and octopi in my brain swimming around, flying around. If any of you haven't seen the documentary on Netflix, My Octopus Teacher, I highly recommend it. It's very moving, and I learned a lot more about their world than I ever thought imaginable. So, and it looks like Larry doesn't have a question after all, so now I don't feel as bad about cutting in line. Corey, you had mentioned a question in the chat box. Did you want to unmute it, or would you prefer that I read it? He says, 1 second.
Am I unmuted?
Yes.
Okay. So my question, and Deke answered it, actually made some sense. But where, I guess we take away the words art, science as two separate categories, to me, there's a tremendous sort of integration between the two. I mean, where does one end and the other begin? Other than one being very verbal and linguistic as far as other being more emotional. But other than that, I mean, some of the most beautiful aesthetic things are in the sciences. Even, and Gay could probably attest to this, but even some mathematical equations are beautiful or artistic, or just understanding how everything works together is in a way a work of art. So I guess my question is, where, or is there a specific dividing line? I think Deke actually answered that actually quite well. So.
Well, but you're getting at something that's really nice, is just sort of like the bleeding of the two things together, and how, just trying to drop the disciplines for a little while to just be experiencing that thing that is happening, whatever you call it. Yeah. It's nice.
Well, it occurs to me that, in childhood, we sort of have this more innate sense of how those two things are married together. So, I would say the average, child who's allowed to play in nature is both scientist and artist. There's finger paints and making mud pies and all of that, but there's also just this innate, sort of scientific curiosity in terms of, where do the bullfrogs go when it gets cold? I wonder where they go, and then discovering that they bury themselves in the mud, for example, which is scientific inquiry if you think about it. So to me, I often come back to the idea of it's not so much that we need to, invent this new sort of hybridized thing, other than more so that we need to just remember what we already knew and has been sort of bifurcated, through cultural narrative that we internalize as we get older.
Yeah, and go ahead.
Oh, no, I just wanted to, go ahead, Karen.
Well, I would go back to Dewey again, and just say it's, for me, because I also agree, Deke, I don't like to really think of it as separate. We have enough of this binary need to create binaries and bifurcate. So, but I think, like Dewey would say that it's really more about art as making experience. Art is about like what you said, Liz, about getting your hands into the dirt and getting your fingers in the process, and it's about making that experience. So science can be about inquiry also, and about the experiments, and about getting and about like the curiosity that kind of will drive scientific inquiry. I think there is that kind of curiosity too that drives artistic inquiry, but I think of it as that the art is in the making of that experience. So.
Well, and fun as well. I mean, that's another thing that we somehow marginalize in society for whatever reason, that, if you're having fun, somehow you're doing something wrong, or like goofing off, or not doing what you're supposed to be doing. And so, where does that come from, and how can we sort of shed some of that cultural baggage?
I think I always have one more thing to say. But I think it really, the thing that has sort of been preoccupying me is the motivation. And I'll bring up Charlie Russell, whom you know that I speak about very often. Charlie made a distinction between, he studied bears for many years. If you want to know a lot more, you can buy my book, right? Talking with Bears. But, and he's written several books. But Charlie's, one of his salient points in terms of trying to communicate to people who are not necessarily of the same philosophy is he said, I've never wanted to study bears. I've always wanted to understand them. And so I think within that, what he was really talking about and what he did talk about was what is our motivation? And Deke, you touched about that. This is kind of existential, ontological kind of thing. So perhaps it's less of the medium than the purpose of utilizing a medium or participating in a kind of a medium. So to me, the notion is comes down to what is the motivation? What's the motivation for crafting a formula? What is the motivation for crafting a painting or a performance? I'm just choosing those kind of randomly in that sense. And I think that's really where it's coming down into, where we're moving from dualism back into non-dualism. When you have non-dualism, everything's all together, right? So when it comes down to it, unless you're just standing still, there has to be some kind of motion. There's some dynamic in life, which means there's some kind of purpose / agenda. And that's really where the crux is. So I don't really personally think that there's a difference between the two. I think the difference lies in the motivation. Like maybe even touches, you, Karen, what you're talking about, that unconsciously you've been moving toward watercolors. What is that reflecting of? What kind of motivation is that? I'm not trying to say, oh, I'm going to do watercolors, but something emerged for you to begin to use watercolors as your medium. And what was that motivation? And what motivates you to even pursue that further?
Yeah, and that was different. And it was different at different times, because I've done watercolor throughout the years in different ways, in different capacities, and the motivation has evolved or changed, or is, it's like not something that I'm totally conscious of. Mm-hmm. I think the need for it, or the desire for it in this past year has been much more of the ability for it to reveal things, to be a teacher, to me, to be a co-creator, if you will, to actually like engage with the medium in such a way where it's not about me dominating it. It's not about me directing it or saying, here, this is what I want it to look like, or I want it to be. And I've done that kind of work as, in terms of intention, and especially over the years to create for the public, so to speak, or for, commercial purposes. It had to be intentional. So this was much more about like, well, what is this grief? What is going on inside me that maybe I just can like learn about and be curious about through a medium that's more spontaneous, that can allow me to be more spontaneous, and not allow me to actually impose or to use my skills and be the authority about it. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, the skills that I've developed, can like help maybe shape it and just like give it certain balance, or certain ways for it to appear that are appealing to me personally. Whether they are to anybody else, I don't know, but it's in that process of engagement, it's like I feel as with nature too. When I'm out in an area that's like a non-constructed nature area, that is not like about a theme park type place where I'm supposed to go and engage in a certain way. I can engage the way that what appears and what I'm attuned to and what I'm noticing. and for me, that's really liberating, and so, ultimately that may be the intention or the motivation is what will be the most liberating potentially.
Thank you.
Did anyone have any final questions or final thoughts for our panelists?
I really appreciate, Karen, your final word about liberating. That's exciting to hear. It is, because we are at a turning point as a civilization in America where we have a lot of that needs to happen, liberating us from a lot of trauma, a lot of racism. And this is, to me, racism is also systemic in how we communicate and treat animals, because that's where our conditioning starts. So in seeing the art, liberating art to express nature and to express animals is going to be incredibly healing for us as humans and how we treat our own species. So I just really celebrate that. Last word you said, Karen, was awesome. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Allison.
Thank you. Well, we appreciate everyone's time. We know, it is the weekend, and so you could be plenty of places, and the fact you chose to spend it with us really means a lot. So thank you very much. Thank you to our panelists, Karen, Maggie, and Deke, and thank you, Dr. Bradshaw, for being the hostess with the mostest. So hopefully
I got stuck with the doctor thing.
I was trying to help them to get your bear book,
Yeah, right.
She's an authority. She's an expert. Just, all kidding aside.
That's what I was telling you. I tell Charlie he's in heaven, but I know where he's in bear heaven. I say, ha, ha, ha. I am now the expert on Charlie Russell. Joke's on you. Thank you guys so much. It was really fun.
Thanks, Kay.
Thank you.
Deke and Maggie and Liz.
Thank you.
Thanks everybody for joining us. It was really fun, and I'm more curious about watching your work, Deke, and then also good luck, Maggie, with your upcoming program. It'd be really great to see more of your work also.
And hopefully we'll see some of the faces in this room there as well. That would be a lot of fun. So thank you all, and have a great rest of your Sunday.
Bye, all. Bye, Allison.
Bye. Bye. Bye, Allison.